Do you feel that you were prepared for what could have happened with the thousands of people that were there? Were you also aware of the attacks on the Prime Minister's residence? And were you briefed? Matthew Green questions the Parliament's security. Here's the clip.
Just without getting into specifics, in the lead up to the occupation, did you take steps to increase the personnel within the precinct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes.
In what range would you, just to percentage-wise, how many more officers were required?
It was an increase of roughly 30%.
And was that at its peak or was that at the beginning?
That would have been throughout.
Okay. So, you had referenced that perhaps the threat of it being breached or there being some kind of overthrow wasn't present. After January 6th, did your organization take any steps to begin preparedness for a like scenario that might occur here in Canada, Mr. McDonnell?
After January 6th, you're referring to the United States?
Correct.
Yeah, that would be Larry's area.
Mr. Broxton?
Yes, we took steps. Again, I think I mentioned earlier the importance of the tabletop, the TTX exercising framework that the service has put in place. And that same January, we commenced tabletop exercises with our partners, which was inclusive of the Ottawa Police Service.
Okay, and when the weapons were found in Coots, you had referenced not knowing what's in the trucks. What precautions did you take to improve the safety and security of the precinct at that time? Did you elevate the threat when you found when you heard that there was a connection with weapons in Coots, or did you do nothing?
The elevation was already there.
It was already if you were to range the different levels of elevation, I don't know if you use colors or codes or whatever, at what level?
It takes me back to my ERT training, Mr. Chair, is that always add one to it. And so the establishment of what happened at Coots was exactly what my thoughts were right on Wellington Street. That
there could have been potential for weapons there.
Yep.
And so when you have did you receive any reports around ideologically motivated violent extremists and the potential for lone wolf actors?
The open source intelligence that the service does, there's always a review of the actors that are involved and what their backgrounds and what their potential ideas are.
So how would you rate that threat given the information that you had?
It would have been up there for me.
Up there, be more specific, sir.
It would have been a heightened security concern if that type of individuals are walking down Wellington Street on a regular basis throughout that period, and I have parliamentarians that are coming to work with their staff. It's a huge concern for me.
And would you have reason to believe that there was that element within the crowd? Not to say that the entire crowd, but within that crowd, there could have been that element.
Absolutely.
And so, given that, and hearing the testimony, is there a possible scenario where, during the police movements to disperse, that there could have been a scenario where the precinct was breached? Or in your opinion, do you feel that your service was adequately prepared to withstand the thousands of people that were out front of Parliament?
Through you, Mr. Chair, so the increased fencing that was put down the Wellington fence was in preparation and readiness for the tactical operation.
I am out of time, unfortunately, and we will continue through. Thank you for that, Mr. Brookson. We will now go on to Monsieur Carillon for 3 minutes, sir.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
5 minutes. Mr. Brookson, are you aware of the attacks on the Prime Minister's residence in July 2020 by an active member of the military?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, I am.
When such attacks and threats are posed to the Prime Minister of this country and federal ministers, are you briefed on that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the notification of that incident was made almost immediately to the service, and the service responded accordingly to increasing its posture until that incident at the Prime Minister's residence was dealt with.
Something to be taken very seriously.
Absolutely.
And are you aware that a released, over the course of the fall, a report from the Internal Counter-Terrorism Report revealed that at least 4 federal ministers, cabinet ministers, were subject to specific violent extremist threats in the lead-up to the Ottawa convoy occupation in January? Were you aware of that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not alive to any of the specifics of those incidents, no.
So if there is a specific threat on the Prime Minister and for cabinet ministers, Mr. McDonnell, are you apprised of these threats?
Yes.
So were you aware at that time that the internal reports for the counterterrorism had identified the Prime Minister and 4 cabinet ministers as being subject to ideologically motivated violent extremists?
I don't recall specifically, but likely I had conversations with contacts in the security community about the security of certain ministers prior to, during, and post convoy.
Okay, help me clarify that. You were made aware, or you weren't made aware, that there was the Prime Minister and 4 cabinet ministers who had specific threats related to the anti-government sentiment within this crowd through open source observation, as well as the calls for political violence against the government. Are you aware of those threats? Yes or no, sir?
I would say yes. I can't definitely say which 4 ministers. If I would say yes, and you ask me which 4
No,
ministers.
I won't be asking
But
that.
I would say a yes, because I have those conversations on a regular basis.
So, given this kind of increased direct threat, anti-government sentiment, calls for political violence as being justified, knowing what happened in January 6th, what steps would you have taken in addition to anything that you had already been proceeding on related to the actual occupation, but specific to ideologically motivated violent extremists? What additional steps and measures would you have taken to assure the safety and security of the Prime Minister and those members of Cabinet?
That falls under the relation of the RCMP, under the responsibility of the RCMP protective operations.
Is there any coordinated effort between the RCMP on those efforts in your?
It would be discussed. Maybe the movements of the ministers on and off the precinct would be discussed at a certain time.
Would there have
and
been any
what we could
direction
do.
from you to the Speaker, or from the Speaker to you regarding this?
No, I would apprise the Speaker if necessary, if we were doing anything different on the precinct.
Okay.
As a
Thank you.
result of the RCMP providing them protection.
Mr. Brookson, given your past experience and your assessment, would your assessment of the security of parliamentarian staff and your members include having a knowledge of the staffing levels of police? Would you, like you mentioned, 135 guns at any given time, 30% additional capacity, we can do the math on that, 150 folks or so. Would you also have a knowledge to how many police officers were present in Ottawa? Did you, on Wellington Street, directly in front of the precinct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no.
You had no idea how many officers were there?
Not the exact numbers, no.
Given your own internal threat assessments on the security of the precinct, would it not make sense that you would have at least some kind of insight into understanding about the capacity of the Ottawa Police in front of the Parliament on Wellington Street?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I was alive to the increased numbers that were being brought in to a certain degree, but what their daily posture was, that was not something that was that I was informed of.
Would that information have helped you at all in making assessments on whether or not you had the appropriate staffing on the precinct to protect against the possibility of a surge and a breaching of the Parliament?
Through you, Mr. Chair, my responsibility is to ensure that the service can act on its own. Although I rely heavily and I appreciate the support that I get
For 90 minutes.
For 90 minutes from my partners. What I have full control over is the 421 protection officers that I'm responsible for.
Thank you. That concludes my round. We will now go on to, I thought I was safe, by the way, Mr. Fortin, when you gave me this.
It is the case.
Right.
Stop.
Safe to stop talking. Okay, I appreciate that. We'll now go on to